All right, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, students. Welcome back to AP Macroeconomics with me, Mr. McRitchie. This is part 2 of our supply and demand series. Hopefully this is part 2 of 2. Hopefully I can get through all of it in just this one video. But in this video, we'll be discussing the idea of equilibrium and disequilibrium. What happens when you take the supply and demand lines and you put them together and you actually do the shifts that we've been talking about with both lines present. What does that do? How does that affect things? How does that change sort of everything that we've been doing for those last video? So we're going to be focusing on that today. It's going to help us figure out what happens to prices and quantities whenever we are shifting things. So what you're going to need to do a lot today, and I'll just give you a fair warning, this is you're going to draw a lot of graphs today. It's very good to get practice on these. So please, 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 whenever I'm emphasizing, hey, you should draw this, you should draw it in your journal. Just looking at me do it does not help it stick in your brain. Again, I mentioned this before with one of my earlier videos, but it's kind of like watching a math teacher do math stuff on the board and just sort of like sitting there like this. None of it's going to stick. It's just not. That's not how these things work. I don't care if you're a visual learner or not. Like, you trust me when I tell you, you're going to need to draw this stuff for it to really stick in your brain. So, with that all being said, let's get right into it. Move my camera up here. Make it smaller. I can't seem to hide my taskbar this time, so you guys know that I have Steam and Discord. I don't care. So, equilibrium. Supply and demand, those two lines exist on the same graph. This is the graph of a market. Capital P is price, capital Q, which is cut off a little bit here, is quantity. You've got supply and you've got demand. Where these two lines meet, this intersection point right there is called equilibrium. And why that matters is this tells me what the market price and the market quantity are. It tells me what the price and quantity of the good should be. If everything is operating smoothly, your price and quantity of your goods should end up here. Because that would mean that the exact quantity that people want on the demand curve equals the exact quantity that businesses want to produce. That everyone is getting what they want at that spot. Why this matters is whenever we do any of the shifts we were talking about on the last video, like, hey, this thing will cause an increase in supply. All right, draw that. I've got this new supply curve that's over to the right. My equilibrium point has now changed. I am now at a different spot. I have the same demand curve, but now I'm down here, which means my price and quantity are going to change. I'm looking at a lower price and a higher quantity. This actually should make sense to you based on the logic of, okay, say businesses want to produce and sell more of a thing. All right. If they want to produce and sell more of the thing, well, if they're producing more of it, and people want it the same, if they wanted to sell it, they're going to have to lower the price, right? The more common a thing is getting, the less valuable it's getting. So if they're producing and selling more, if they're producing and trying to sell more of it, they're going to need to scale down the price. They will sell more if they do this because of how law of demand works. People buy more stuff at lower prices. So the quantity will go up, but the price will go down. As more companies enter into a market, this happens. Like, think of all of the streaming services that have come out the last year. As these streaming services grow and grow and grow, and there's more and more and more of them, they have to start coming out at lower and lower price points. It's why Peacock is fairly reasonably priced, even though it's dumb to get a streaming service called Peacock. Apple TV, which does exist, is like $5 a month. Disney Plus is fairly affordable and reasonable. Netflix has had to scale down their price. Hulu bundles itself with Disney Plus. They're making it cheaper for each independent streaming service because there are so many now. The supply of them is growing. The demand of them is staying the same. We want to watch things. We don't want to have to pay for 17 streaming services. So they're having to lower the price more and more and more. The idea for what we're going to focus on today really is all of those things from the previous lesson, all those examples. Let's apply them to this visual and see what happens to price and quantity. So let's give you a practical example. Draw a supply and demand graph for the market for rubber bands. So draw the X and Y axis. Capital P is your Y axis. Capital Q is your X axis. Supply is your upward sloping line. Demand is your downward sloping line. Have yourself an equilibrium. This is a terrible drawing because I'm having to do it freehand with a mouse, so apologies for this not looking pretty. It actually turned out okay. Quantity and price. So this is my little starting point graph. I want you to draw what happens on this graph if consumers, specifically and only consumers, expect the price of rubber bands to rise in the future. In case you're wondering how I'm labeling this, My equilibrium I label as PE. My equilibrium quantity I label as QE. That is hard to tell that's a Q because I'm, again, using the mouse to write. So that's a capital Q, capital E. So this is my initial equilibrium point. Yes, you do need to label that. The AP exam does care about that. So draw what will happen on this graph if consumers expect the price to go up in the future. So you're a consumer, you think about it. What would you do? You're thinking about buying rubber bands, you know they're going to get more expensive in the future. What do you do right now? Well, if I'm you, or if I'm me in this situation, and I need to get rubber bands, and I know they're going to be more expensive in the future, I'm going to want them right freaking now. I'm going to go to Staples or wherever, and I'm going to buy them right now. It's consumers' behavior that's being affected. Consumers are demanders. We're the ones that demand things. And if we expect the price to go up in the future, we demand more right now. Remember, in TRIPE, it was T-R-I-P-E. The E was expectations of future price changes. And when we think the price of a thing is going to go up in the future, we demand more of it right now. So demand rises for the good. And then what happens to my price and quantity? Well, my quantity has gone up and my price has gone up. If we want more rubber bands, we're going to be purchasing more rubber bands, so quantity is going to go up. And if we want more rubber bands, businesses will be able to justifiably raise the price, which is kind of annoying based on the scenario, right? The scenario is we think the price is going to go up in the future, and our behavior is going to cause that price to go up sooner than we thought. Ooh, that's annoying. That is what happens. It's why businesses will sometimes leak information about the fact that things are going to get more expensive in the future. Like, hey guys, just warning you, we're going to start raising the price of this thing next month. And then people are like, oh, you can't trick me, I'm going to go buy it now. And the business is like, cool, now we can raise the price. More of you guys are buying it, wanting to buy it, now we can raise the price now. Thanks, everybody. Gotcha. So this is the idea for the graph. You need to be able to draw sort of this type of visual. And yes, all the labeling is important. The arrows you need for the AP exam. Whenever you're drawing a graph, mentions the production possibilities curve, you need to have the arrow. It is required. You do not get credit without the arrow. I know that's annoying. You label the new line. I labeled it D1. I labeled my equilibrium. The dotted line is how I do that. These are not optional things that I'm doing here. These are not choices I'm making. These are things you have to do to get credit. Like your lines on your graphs have to be solid. Don't do dashed lines. Don't do weird, like, silly shape lines. No, solid line is your line. Dotted line is equilibrium. Hey, looky here. So this is a good visual of how your graph should look like. It's a bit sloppy because I'm doing it with a mouse and keyboard, but it looks pretty good compared to some of the students that I see work on these things. Okay. So whenever we're seeing an increase in demand like the one I just showed you, you should see this type of visual happening. Here's a nice little shorthand for it. When demand shifts to the right, price and quantity go up. If we want a thing more, we'll buy more of it, and businesses can charge more for it. That makes logical sense. If demand decreases, if we want something less, we'll buy less of it, and businesses will not be able to charge as much for it, right? If things become less popular, their price will start to fall. Their value will start to fall. Think of how, like, sports teams, when they get, like, not good at sports, people don't want to see their games as much, so the ticket sales go down and the ticket prices become cheaper. Increase in supply, I already showed you this with the streaming service example, but when there's an increase in the supply of a good or a service, means businesses are trying to sell more of it. They're going to have to charge less for it if they want to just magically sell more, but they will increase the quantity. So increase in the supply, if they're producing more and more of the goods, they'll have to start lowering the price of the goods to actually get them, like, off store shelves and stuff. And the quantity will rise. If you've got a decrease in supply, that means businesses aren't wanting to produce as much of it, but here's the tricky part. If they don't want to produce as much of it, they're going to need to sell at a higher price to maintain profit. So price will start to rise, and quantity will fall as a result. So if supply goes down, if it becomes harder to produce things, or if they're producing less and less things, they're going to charge more for those things because they're becoming more scarce, and they'll sell less of them. Supply decreases, price up, quantity down. So here's all of that in verbal form. Whatever happens to demand happens to price and quantity. They move together when it's demand. Supply splits them. Supply, price goes one way, quantity goes the other. So these are like your little, like, verbal, like, written out shorthands for each of the equilibriums. But you can usually do it with logic too. The graph is more of a fail-safe for some of you guys. So here's some examples. So I live in DFW for any of you guys that are watching this who don't go to our school. But here's our example. You don't have to draw each of these, just sort of think through them. So we've got market for Dallas Mavericks tickets. The event Luka Doncic, who's a player on the Mavs, becomes an MVP candidate. This happened basically last year. What happens in that graph? Is it supply or demand? Is this a consumer or a producer thing? What happens to price and quantity? All right. Popularity is what's being affected here. That sounds most like taste and preferences, right? Because people like good players, people like good teams, people like interesting sports things happening. So that's a consumer thing. So it would be an increase in demand, which if demand for a good goes up, you should see price and quantity of the good go up. This makes sense. If we're talking about Mavs tickets and they've got a player on the team that is becoming like really, really awesome to watch, the team can charge more for tickets and will sell more tickets. It's the logical idea here. Second example, market for lumber. Event is OSHA, which is the government agency that tries to keep people from like dying at work. Requires sawmill workers to wear new expensive safety glasses. Those safety glasses are being paid for by the company. That equipment's paid for by the company, not by the workers. So government agencies requiring sawmill workers to wear new expensive safety glasses. The company's got to pay for the safety glasses. Okay, you got to think. Is this a producer or a consumer issue primarily? Does this affect consumers or producers more? Consumers of lumber or the producers of lumber? Who's being more affected by this? Well, if it's a safety regulation, the consumers aren't really being affected by that. Cool, I'm glad they're being safer. That doesn't really change how much wood I want. It does change the business's ability to produce it, though. Why? They gotta buy, I wrote the word expensive for a reason. These safety glasses are expensive. This is a higher input cost for the business. The lumber companies have to spend more money to make their product because they gotta pay for all this equipment. All right, they gotta pay more for their thing. Can they produce as much of their thing? No? All right, supply goes down. Decrease in supply, again, leftward shift is a decrease in supply. A decrease in supply leads to a higher price because they're going to sort of pass off this expense to their customers. That's usually how it goes. And you're going to see a decrease in the quantity. So they're going to sell less of the thing and sell it at a higher price. Market for pizza. Incredible Pizza Machine doubles the amount of pizzas that can be baked in 20 minutes. Okay, it's just way faster bake time for pizza. That producer versus consumer, that's more production side kind of thing. So this should be a supply shifter, and the supply should probably go up. Quantity up, price down. Market from Nike's. Commerce Department reports that consumer incomes rose this year. Okay, consumer versus producer. Pause, think about it. Consumer, so it's demand. If people have more money, they're willing to buy more. They're going to be willing to buy more stuff, right? So demand goes up. Nike can start to charge more for their shoes, and they'll still sell more of them. And then example one more time. Government puts a luxury tax of 10% on the production of expensive automobiles. This is for BMWs. Producers pay that tax, okay? Well, it says producers like in the sentence, so I'm pretty sure this is a supply thing. If they pay the tax, they can't produce as much. Supply goes down, price up, quantity down. Okay, so those are all just one shift of the line. Hopefully that makes sense to you. The idea being, okay, supply and demand can change. I know that from the previous set of notes. All right, then let me see what happens if I increase or decrease supply or demand. And then see what happens to price and quantity. Now what happens if they both change? If we have two scenarios given. Now, so let me give you a disclaimer here that is important to mention. When it comes to supply and demand changing, in order for it on the AP exam to be like a doable thing, if they want both supply and demand to change, they have to give you two scenarios. One scenario that changes supply and one scenario that changes demand. They have to like basically create a conjoined sentence of like this happens and this happens. You don't have to ever overthink it and be like, wait a minute, consumer incomes rise. So wouldn't businesses want to produce more and people buy more? It's like, no. Income, people buy more, stop there. You're always thinking of just one shift at a time. So if they give you two scenarios, then you can have two shifts. So if you do that, it's going to create a kind of issue on the graph, because here's how I'll show it to you. So say we have an increase in demand and an increase in supply. So I'm drawing both. I started here, I am ending here. I have S and D. I now have moved both lines over to the right. I'm now at S1 and D1. This point right here is my new equilibrium spot. There's like 4 intercepts, so it's hard to keep track, but it's where the 2 new lines meet is where my new equilibrium is. So they gave me a scenario that increased demand and then another scenario that increased supply. All right. What happened to my quantity? Well, my quantity for sure went up. I went from here to here. X value has increased substantially. What's happened to price? It went down because of the increase in supply. It went back up because of the increase in demand. Wait a minute, what happened to price? It looks like it didn't change. It looks like nothing happened to price. The reason why it looks like that is because I moved both lines by the exact same amount. Is there anything about these questions that has been telling us how much to move supply and demand by? No, there really hasn't been anything in these scenarios that are telling us how much to move supply and demand by. So could I tell for certain that I would move them by the same amount? Probably not. So what it's saying right here is that if supply and demand both increase, price is indeterminate. It means that we can't actually know what happened to the price, because the price could have gone down, it could have gone up. If they were by the exact same amount, it could have not changed. Does that make sense? I hope it makes sense. It's so hard for people to grasp this part. The idea is that it could have gone up or down. It could have stayed the same. We actually don't know what happens to price. Quantity, I know what happens to it, because if I increase supply, quantity goes up. If I increase demand, quantity goes up. So quantity for sure goes up. But when I increase supply, price goes down. When I increase demand, price goes up. If the demand is greater than the supply change, then price would overall go up. If the supply change is greater than the demand change, the price would overall go down. I don't know which one is bigger. They don't tell me which one is bigger. So the price is indeterminate. If they both decreased, it would opposite direction, like this. If I decreased both, I would get quantity definitely went down, price again indeterminate. Whenever you move both lines, one of your variables becomes indeterminate. Whenever you move supply and demand, one of your variables becomes indeterminate. If you're moving them both in the same direction, price is indeterminate. If you move both lines in opposite directions, quantity becomes indeterminate. So example. This is what I mean by they have to have 2 scenarios given. What happens to the price and quantity of tea if the price of sugar, a complement for tea, decreases and more companies begin producing and selling tea due to rising caffeine addiction? So the price of sugar, which is a complement for tea, decreases and more companies begin producing and selling tea. So what happens on that graph? There are 2 scenarios. We're going to see one supply change and a demand change. Draw it and then see what happens to price and quantity. Remember that something has to be indeterminate here. Let me give myself a equilibrium to go off of. Apologize for the loud mouse, by the way. I actually can't hear it because these are noise-canceling headphones, but I listened to one of my videos recently and realized that my mouse is very loud. I am sorry. My mic is just good at picking up noise, and I can't seem to fix that. So, scenario 1, the price of sugar or complement for tea decreases. Complementary goods are goods that people use together. Okay, so if sugar is cheaper, I would buy more sugar and then want more tea to go with it. So this is an increase in the demand for tea. This is assuming something. So I know some people don't drink tea with sugar. This is just telling you in this scenario, yes. I'm not going to label equilibrium yet because I actually have to do 2 shifts. But I've got this new demand curve over here. And then more companies begin producing and selling tea. More companies producing and selling tea. That's a supply shifter. Oh, that's terrible looking. There we go. Doesn't look good either, but it's a little more parallel. So this is my new equilibrium point right over here. I have definitely a higher quantity, but my price looks like it didn't change. If it looks like it didn't change, it's indeterminate. If it looks like it didn't change, that's the variable that is indeterminate. Because what's happened there is that when my supply went up, my price should have ended down there. When my demand went up, my price should have ended up here. Price goes up, price goes down. Wait, what happened to price? I don't know. Indeterminate is a fancy way of saying I don't know. It's the fanciest way of saying I don't know. Now, if you move them in different directions, say that I decrease supply and I increase demand, then what happens is actually the opposite. My price, I can actually very easily tell what happened to it. I started here and I ended up here. My price is significantly higher than before. My quantity looks like it didn't change, so that becomes indeterminate. So when you move them in opposite directions, it's your quantity that is now indeterminate, and your price is what you can tell changes. So when you move them in opposite directions, quantity is indeterminate, which makes sense because if I'm moving one line to the right and one line to the left, I don't actually know what's happening to my x value because they're in conflict, right? I don't know if the rightward shift is bigger than the leftward shift or not. I don't know if they're the same size. I don't know if they offset. So I can't say for sure what happens to quantity. So quantity is indeterminate. I know if I increase demand, things get more expensive. I know if I decrease supply, things get more expensive. So price is gonna go up. But I don't know what happens to quantity. If I did the opposite, if I increased supply and decreased demand, I would see it go down. Like overall, the graph, the X shape that we looked at is shifting downward. Remember, that's my initial equilibrium where S and D meet. This spot right there is my new equilibrium where S1 and D1 meet. My X-shaped line graph has just straight up moved downward. So my Y value is lower. Price has gone down. My X value is staying the same visually, which means it's indeterminate. Don't know what's happening to quantity there. Okay. So that's it for simultaneous shifts. That is a very good thing to practice a couple of times and to make sure you understand and to write down a lot of the things I was saying, because those weren't typed on the screen, a lot of that. That when you shift supply and demand, there needs to be two scenarios given, and one of your two variables will be indeterminate. Okay, that's the thing that's not typed anywhere on this PowerPoint. You should just write that down, because a lot of things that I'm saying are more important than the things that you're seeing visually. So whenever there's two scenarios given, that's when you can have two shifts. And whenever you have two shifts, you end up with some variable becoming indeterminate. If I move both lines in the same direction, price is indeterminate. If I move both lines in opposite directions, it's quantity that's indeterminate. Cool? Cool. Home stretch, last thing. Disequilibrium. So sometimes you'll see graphs where you're not actually at equilibrium, because the question will usually have to tell you this. They'll have to give you some numbers to help you out. So let's give you some numbers to help you out. Let's say the quantity here is 10. Let's say the price here is 5. So that's equilibrium. The question might say something like, hey, the price of this good is presently $7. The price of this good is presently $7. Putting numbers here to give me a good visual for this. So I'm not at 5, I'm at 7. I'm not at equilibrium then, right? Things are off. This is not great. This is disequilibrium. If my price is occurring where supply and demand are not equivalent to each other, then we've got disequilibrium, which you've actually seen this in the real world a lot. If the price is too high, what's happening in the store? If the price is too high, people won't buy it, right? The quantity demanded, and on the visual that I'm giving you, is 8. People will buy 8 of this good at $7, but businesses, because they want to make lots of money, would actually love to have this good at 12. They'd be willing to produce and sell 12 of them. So the store has 12 of the good. People only bought 8. There's 4 left over. That's a surplus of 4. There's a surplus of 4 of whatever good this is. Say it's like, what's the thing that's like normally $10? A cheap t-shirt at like Kohl's. Oh no, $5, sorry. This thing's normally like $5. A coffee? Yeah, say it's a coffee. 10 people willing to buy a coffee at $5. Only 8 people are willing to buy a coffee at $8, but the business is willing to make 12 coffees. So now there's just 4 coffees sitting there that no one wants to get. So there's this surplus. If the price is higher than it's supposed to be, you're going to see a higher quantity supplied than quantity demanded. So you've created a surplus. Well, what will happen in the long run? Like, as you give that company time, what are they going to do? They're probably going to realize that, like, uh-oh, we made too much of the thing. We should make less, and if we're going to make less, we should charge less for it too. Exactly. They'll lower the price and get back to equilibrium. This happens with clothing stores every season, right? That's how sales work, is that they have the price a little too high at the start. They know it's going to stay on the shelf for a little bit, then they lower the price get closer and closer and back to equilibrium. Once they've sold out and they don't have any like extra that they wanted to produce, boom, bang, boom, they have created equilibrium. Because in the real world, you don't like start at equilibrium a lot of the time. Like that would be very lucky and doesn't make a lot of sense because businesses aren't perfect. They don't always make the right call. So a lot of times they'll start off at disequilibrium and over time adjust and realize, uh-oh, we should move. Now I'm going to do the opposite here real quick, which is to say, okay, same thing, same good, except we go the opposite way. Say that the coffee is now $4 and it's now below equilibrium. Still have the 8 and the 12 here, except that the 8 is no longer the quantity demanded. Look, that 8 is on my supply curve. So the business is only willing to produce and sell 8 of the thing, but people want to buy 12 of it. They really like that price being low. They want to buy 12. There's only 8 people. It's going to run out. And it's going to run out in a negative way. Like 4 people are going to be pissed. You've created a shortage. If the price is lower than it's supposed to be, then your quantity demanded will exceed your quantity supplied. People will want more of a thing than a business is willing to produce and sell, and you'll see a shortage. And again, over time, the business will realize, oh, we could actually charge more of it for this thing than we think. People want it really, really bad. We can charge more, and if they charge more, they'll eventually gravitate back towards equilibrium. So over time, market will always try and move towards equilibrium as long as there isn't like any barrier stopping them from doing that. There are some barriers that can exist. Like a good example of a forced surplus that we have is the minimum wage. Like the minimum wage says that you can't charge any less than $7.25 an hour. You can't pay your workers any less than that unless they're like a waiter or a waitress. Okay, well if you do that, then some businesses will not be able to hire as many people as they would like, because if they could pay them like $5 an hour, they'd hire more people and have them work more hours. So we've got this quantity supplied of workers that want to work and this quantity demanded of businesses that want to hire those workers, and you've got a surplus of people who don't have a job. The surplus is unemployment in that example. And for like a shortage, we've got a price ceiling on like, well, one of them is like crazy. It's like water at restaurants is $0. But another example would be like Ticketmaster, making it so that they can't do crazy markups on ticket resale. So businesses can't go crazy high price, so it's created a shortage for the good. Things like that. So these things can be like enforced by the government, although price swings aren't a thing that the AP exam specifically covers anymore. The idea is if the price is not at equilibrium, you're going to have either a surplus or a shortage. If the price is too high, surplus, businesses will have a lot of the good, we won't want to buy it. Price too low, shortage, it'll run out real fast. And then all that stuff is animated. And then there's the shortage one right there. And I mentioned the price ceiling and price floor thing. So, for these, what you need to be really cognizant of and careful of and thinking about, let me switch back to this, when it comes to like your equilibrium, disequilibrium, supply and demand things. Practice, practice, practice. I mean, we're going to do practice assignments on this a couple of times because it's a thing that you really need repetition on. The best way to do it is sort of either look through news stories or just start asking your friends for weird scenarios where supply and demand can be affected. Go through those lists of acronyms and try and make up a scenario for each acronym. Pick a market, a random good, something from your backpack or your room that you're in and be like, okay, I see a hoodie, market for hoodies. I'm going to taste and preferences because I just going down the list. Taste and preferences, hoodies become more popular because fashion, which is true. I mean, hoodies have gotten more popular the last 2 years, I think, as like a more of like a fashion forward thing because you can have like hoodies with like a cool graphic on them and stuff like that, right? So you say market for hoodies, taste and preferences, popularity based on those advertising trends and those things like TikTok and everything like that. Cool, great. Demand should do what? Should go up. Okay, if demand goes up, price goes up, quantity goes up. Go through like that. Point at things in your room. Go through the list of Stripe and Sepin and try and think of stuff for each of them. The one I would not worry about as much as like profitability of joint supply like that. Doesn't work very often, and they don't use it a lot in the AP exam. But try and go through basically all of them with that logic and practice what happens to price and quantity. When in doubt, draw it out. And if you need to draw it, but you don't want to have to keep like wasting paper, you can do what I do, which is I use a finger graph a lot of the time. My right hand is demand, my left hand is supply, and I make the graph little X thing with my fingers. So if I'm like, okay, I'm going to increase demand here, I'm going to take my right hand and move it up to the right, okay, where my two little fingers overlap. When I'm looking at it from my perspective, it's hard to see from the camera, but with my perspective, it's like, okay, it looks like it moved up and to the right. If you do it with your fingers right now, if you make that X and you take your right hand and you move it a little bit to the right, where your fingers overlap will be like further up along your knuckle. You'll have like a higher point. So I would have higher price. And it's now more towards the right, so it would be a higher quantity. So you can always finger graph or use like a full Des Bryant style X with your arms and move up and down, left and right with those. The other thing to make sure that you practice a couple of times is simultaneous shifts. So don't be afraid to throw two scenarios at yourself with an object in your room. Looking at your lamp, demand goes up for lamps because, I don't know, like lamps cure cancer, who cares? And supply goes down for lamps because businesses can't afford to produce lamps anymore because some component of lamps, like filament, becomes really expensive. Whatever. So I do like, okay, demand goes up, supply goes down, all right, price is higher, quantity is indeterminate. Go through that a lot and just point at stuff in your room, point at things you're seeing, and make up scenarios. The scenarios can be dumb. The point is that you're trying to figure out, okay, supply or demand, increase, decrease, what happens to price and quantity as a result. The surplus and the shortage thing are usually fairly easy to understand in terms of like, oh, if the price is too high, people won't want to buy it, so there'll be a bunch left over, so there will be a surplus. Or price is too low, people will want to buy it too much, it'll run out, they'll have a shortage. That isn't as hard. But your shifts, make sure you practice drawing them a handful of times, make sure you practice doing them a bunch. Because the more you practice the graph shifts, the better you get at them. I am amazing at them because I've taught this class for 5 years, have 6 class periods, twice a semester, or 2 different semesters, so I've taught this class, sweet God, like maybe 50 times I've taught this class, technically speaking, with like different class periods. So I've drawn an insane amount of graphs. So I'm very good at this. But for you guys, you haven't done this at all, so you're going to need to practice it a handful of times. I'll have assignments that I practice, but the best way to do it is just quiz yourself on it. Because with supply and demand, you can quiz yourself on it all the time. It's very easy because it's an everyday, every object can have supply and demand because every object can be bought and sold. Just like point at thing, make up scenario, what happens to price and quantity. And you'll get better and better and better at it. That's my advice for this. So for this video, the big things that you want to review and make sure that you understand are equilibrium. What happens to price and quantity whenever I shift supply and or demand? What happens to price and quantity when I shift both supply and demand? And then disequilibrium. If I see a surplus or a shortage, how does that work? What happens if they tell me the price isn't at the equilibrium price? Gasp. Which happens, it's fine. It just means that you're going to have a surplus or a shortage. So go through those 4 things, make sure that you're doing them right, make sure that you understand those concepts. If you don't, if you've got questions, comments, or concerns, usually I have a lot of questions over the indeterminate thing because it's hard. If you've got questions, comments, or concerns over that indeterminate thing or anything else in this video, feel free to leave those in the comment section of the video. I will check them and respond to them best of my ability. And if I have to record a follow-up video to help explain it better, because, sometimes I explain things bad, that's fine. I will do my absolute best. Thank you guys very much. I wish you the absolute best of luck. Have a good one.